Well, I see everybody's hanging in there to it. I appreciate that. I wanted to just touch on a couple of points of yesterday. I want to make sure you got them. But you remember I told you about the excise tax and how extensive it was in the Netherlands? There's one quote here in the book I couldn't find at the moment, but the English diplomat, and he said, when in a tavern a certain dish of fish is eaten with the usual sauce, about 30 several excises are paid. That shows you how extensive the tax was, and it's no small wonder that it ruined the Netherlands. One of the great men of the Enlightenment is Montesquieu, and I think, if you want to get a book that you should have in your library, try and get his The Spirit of Laws. And the interesting thing, in my experience with it, I referred to it in more than one of the book, and the editors always change the spirit of the laws. And I say, why did you do that? The title of the book is The Spirit of Laws. Well, we thought it sounded better. Yeah, but that's the title. You idiots, this is the way you feel. You do, I've written a few books, and you have to battle the editors, and even you have to battle some of them to the point where you almost want to go kill them because they changed. I have a very good girl. She worked with Doubleday, and she does my final work, and she is really good. She doesn't change me at all. She simply puts it in, and she says, you write the way you speak, and it flows nice. He says, I don't want to interfere with it, so I keep her. She's very good. I have to now send the stuff up. She lives up in St. John, Newfoundland now, but I still keep in touch with her. But one of the things that Montesquieu said, and I think it's worth dwelling on it, he said, liberty sows the seeds of its own destruction. Now, I touched yesterday. Did I slip over too fast, or did that's almost an inconsistency. How could liberty sow the seeds of its own destruction? I gather, yeah.
It allows people to do things unchecked because there is that liberty, and negative or perhaps evil things can go unchecked.
Well, that's kind of what he said was, because he dealing with taxes, you see, and he said that people let their guard down, so to speak, and that they'll consent to excessive taxes, because that's easy, and then once they get these excessive taxes, then they're really in trouble because the government now requires, and is the word, extraordinary powers of oppression to enforce the excessive taxes. So what you've done, believing in liberty, you think government's something wonderful, and so we'll approve that, and then of course, then the government has trouble collecting, and then they come down with a sledgehammer. And so that's historical thing. And the other thing about Montesquieu that I like is that he was a historian. He was not a philosopher in the sense that he concocted or logically came to these conclusions. He used history to back up the conclusions that he had. And he seems to me to have had historical sources that I don't know where they came from, because some of the events that he talks about, I didn't know about them, and yet they're there, and he doesn't document them like we'd like today, a footnote or something. He just states that this happened historically. So I think that when we think of Montesquieu, it's called The Spirit of Laws. You can get it in paperback. It's a wonderful read. You'll love it. And it has been said that the American Constitution would not be what it was today if it weren't for his book. He's the one that expounded the separation of powers, the legislative, executive, and judicial. And he laid it out, and he thought that that's what the British system was. But wasn't quite so. A lot of people say, well, he kind of misinterpreted it. But anyway, it's become the foundation of our Constitution. One of the things that also occurred in this period, that kind of gets us up into the modern American story, is, remember Walpole and his excise tax dragon and all the troubles he had. And he said he was going to use the full weight of the crown to enforce his tax, on the British people. And he really did. The rigors, I think that one British writer says that the rigors of his enforcement is hardly consistent with a free people. And that was Blackstone in his great treatise. Apparently that was one of the things that Lincoln actually read, was Blackstone, although he never understood it, is my understanding.
But in this country, we pass a tax to accomplish a certain thing, but it never gets repealed. We pass the sales tax to help build schools during the period of integration. But as soon as the schools were built, they kept on the sales tax anyway.
Yeah, wasn't that the earliest lesson of tax history, going all the way back to the city of Lagash in Sumer, in Iraq, going back to the very beginning of time. We have the story of the fact that they had this war and they instituted these new heavy taxes, and when the war was over, the tax people wouldn't give up their powers. As I mentioned, it happened in Canada, it happens everywhere. It's also true not just with taxes. The great danger of the Patriot Act and so many of these acts is that these intrusions in order to catch the bad guys, and then when the bad guys are gone, we still got them. So when we have bad, abusive, penal laws, we get stuck with them. And it seemed to be just the way of governments. They just don't want to give up their powers, yeah?
Isn't there one of the federal taxes on your phone bill?
Yeah.
Goes back to something to the Spanish.
Yeah.
Something totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
That it has no business being there. Now with the internet, somebody ought to, get up a petition campaign and get rid of this.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad laws on the book. There really are. It's amazing.
The worst thing is, since you brought this subject up about telephone, they started the Gore tax, which was added every telephone line you had to pay extra to service rural libraries. And I said, wait a minute. Revenues are supposed to go into the House of Representatives. You can't do that on the executive branch. I'm sitting there, everybody ignores it. No, that's just a fee. It's not a tax. Well, come on. It's a tax. You know what I do. But to me, it's totally unconstitutional.
Well, we have a lot of that. One of the interesting stories, I think it's in my book, is about Davy Crockett. We all remember Disneyland, the Davy Crockett. Well, Davy Crockett was a real guy, and he was in Congress. And he voted for some appropriations for a fire in Georgetown down in Washington, D.C. And when he came back, for re-election every 2 years and so forth, one of the guys came up to him and said, David, I supported you, but I ain't supporting you now because you had no business appropriating money to help the people from the fire in Georgetown. Constitutionally, you can't do that. You don't have the right to spend our money for that. And that gets you into an interesting provision of the Constitution. I might as well jump into it. It's a question that's always fascinated me because the Constitution says that tax money's going to be spent for three things: for the common defense, to pay the debt to the United States, the common defense. It didn't say you could engage in offensive wars. And Hamilton, and everybody cites him, as the great big government guy of the period, he writes, and I think it's in 35 or 34 of the Federalist, he said, we are embarking on a novel experiment in the Constitution. We are tying up the hands of government and preventing them from engaging in offensive wars. And then he said that wars for the defense of the country, because war is so expensive, that's okay. But we are preventing wars of offense. Now, when you think about that, you wonder, well, what are we doing in Iraq? If that's not an offensive war, I don't know what. And Vietnam was an offensive war. And we even maybe World War I, we went charging in there like a bunch of damn fools. We certainly went after the Spanish. You know, we remember the Maine, you know, when those ugly Spanish blew up the Maine. And then, of course, years later, we pulled it up and found out it was internal combustion caused by coal dust. But you see, and Hamilton, though, he's considered, you know, the great extremist in terms of big government and power. But he tells us that, and that's in the Federalist, and lays it out pretty clear that that's why they said appropriation or taxes for the common defense. And no offense, but I'm getting a little ahead of you. But I think it indicates the fact that you can't trust what government says. You can't even trust the Constitution. It has the provision that they get tossed out the window. I guess who was it that wrote? He was a humorist. No, he wrote in the 1920s, and he mentioned about the Constitution, and he said. The provisions of the Constitution and Bill of Rights had been thrown out the window, you know, and strange and novel interpretations have been applied. I guess it was mentioned, yeah.
In that same vein, some people that are in favor of doling out government goodies to the less fortunate, don't they say that clause, and for the general welfare.
Yeah. Well,
what did the founders intend that to mean?
It wasn't an appropriation power, you know, because general welfare, I mean, any old thing, you know, that's what it counts to. But they had these restrictions in the early days where you couldn't do it. In fact, I think President Monroe was faced with the need for certain harbor improvements. And he said, I can't do it without a constitutional amendment because there's no authorization for me to spend taxpayers' money to improve the harbors. So they really believed in the Constitution in the old days, and then now it you know, anything goes. But anyway, you try to remember that Hamilton thing. We're embarking on a novel experiment, tying up the hands of government and preventing them from engaging in offensive wars and founded on reasons of state. And reason of state is a French term which means for the best interest of the state. So there it is, and there's Hamilton, and there it is. I think it's 34 or 35 of the Federalist. Yes?
Going back to Crockett, it's been a long time since I read the story you were talking about, but I think you learned a famous lesson from that constituent who chewed him out about appropriating money. They were trying to appropriate money for a pension or approve a pension for a widow of an admiral or something that died. He'd been a war hero, and there was clearly no basis for the pension, but except for the fact they just wanted to
do it.
Widow.
And now
so he stood up and made a speech and pretty much said the same things that the constituent had said to him. I think it was defeated, but at least he learned his lesson.
Well, the constituent said, "I'm not going to vote for you, Mr. Crocker, because you did this." You know, and I guess he got him with his pants down because, well, gee, how can you go against taking care of people that have had misfortune and widows and fire victims and so forth? That's not what the Constitution was designed to do and able to do, and that's not what he can do. And of course, it's so sad as we see that there isn't anything left of the Constitution. I think that the only thing that really left is the fact that the president serves for 2 terms and 4 years for each term. You know, I mean, we've got to the point now where there just is no limit to government. We have the concept, and I learned this in political science in college, of American government here was the federal system with limited endowment of powers, and they could only do this. You can read it. You know, not only they can coin money, because now they don't, they print it. I mean, now we're in the paper world. They can punish piracy on the high seas. Well, we don't have that problem anymore. They got uniform laws of bankruptcy. You go down the line. You know, they were very specific in what we can do, but none of that applies anymore. It's kind of too bad.
I love when they take the oath of office and they swear to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I always think, well, domestic would be a good start. Don't worry about the foreign, just take care of it at home.
You know, that thing with Davy Crockett, the end of that was, first of all, it was a Tennessee farmer that said this.
That's
to
right.
me, that says so much, because here you have an ordinary person who knew about the Constitution. And second, Crockett was defeated.
Yeah.
He was defeated in that election. And he said to the people of Tennessee, quote, "To hell with you, and I'm going to Texas."
Yeah. Well,
He was shocked by, I think of the story, he was shocked by the fact that the old farmer knew somebody.
You bet he did.
Yeah.
People knew what this government was about. Yeah.
It's too bad we didn't. It's too bad they don't publish those things in books and in television. It's interesting. If you read the foreword by Alvin Rabushka, and when I talked to him on the phone, he went to Hollywood and tried to see if Hollywood would make a TV series on my book on the history of taxes. In fact, he says in there, he said it'd be a gold mine for a TV series, but they don't do things like that, I guess. Well, we talked about Walpole, and he was the first prime minister, but in 1732, long before the American problem, and he was having all these excise tax revolts that were really pretty rough. The governor of Virginia said to him that he thought they could tax the colonies successfully. And Walpole, in his wisdom, said, "I already have Old England against me. I don't need to have New England against me." So it never happened. And then
good things to say, Walpole, in your book.
Yeah.
Did it had a currency which made it? How did you say when he left, it was much better? The biography, when Walpole, he gave a good.
Yeah. Also, they said that when he came to office, he had the worst tariff in the world, and when he left, he had the best.
Because the excise tax, they stopped him. I mean, export tax.
Well, the excise tax, of course, was an internal tax, as you know. So.
I meant export. He said
Export tax. Well, there used to be a lot of those trade taxes in Britain, the Corn Laws and things like that, and tax on exports. And he was the one that killed all that because he wanted to encourage trade and business. And I think it was one of the things you see that the North was quite concerned with when the South seceded, but they would put an export tax on cotton going north, so that the American clothing industry would have to pay a tax to get their cotton, and that was one of the motives for striking down the secession movement. Well, anyway,
part of that was to protect the British Isles because they could not raise enough food, or did not raise enough food, and they did not want any of it shipped out.
Okay, I understand. But anyway, he got rid of that. He was a bit of the first free trader, because this was when the free trade philosophy was beginning to grow in the world, not with Lincoln and that bunch, but anyway. One of the problems that developed in America at this time was that smuggling was pretty rampant. They had the Molasses Act around 1730 or so, and this was designed to prevent cheap French molasses and sugar from coming into the colonies and competing against the British sugar, which was coming in from the British colonies. The only thing is, it never worked very well. They were just not able to shut down the smuggling. It was not a very successful trade act, but it was one that set the stage. And one of the things, one of the New England traders I like, he talks about the Yankee smuggler. And they said these guys smuggle and they complain, and when we try to stop the smuggling, they complain about their rights, And when one guy said, if you talk to an American about paying taxes or about these various laws, he gives you a lengthy lecture on his rights, which was the American view. Well, out of this, we had to try and crack down on smuggling, we had the writ of assistance. And this was a device that was developed in England in which a customs officer would think that somebody had some smuggled goods. And so he would go to a judge, and he'd swear out an affidavit, and the affidavit would give the customs officer the right to bring in a policeman almost for assistance in making the search. It was called a writ of assistance. So you assisted the custom officer based on an affidavit, based on an order from a judge. Well, it came to America in a different form. In a different form, there was no judge. All a custom officer had to do was sign a writ of assistance and go down and get the cops, and they'd go out and proceed to make a search. So they eliminated the judicial part of it, which became part of the Fourth Amendment ultimately, because we didn't want to have police officers making searches without court orders. And we still have some of that left, don't we?
IRS.
Well, the IRS has got the vest pocket summons. That's a little different. So the IRS guy can walk up to you and pull in his vest pocket and hit you with a summons and order you to bring in whatever he wants. No judge involved at all. So the vest pocket summons, that's the name of it, that the agents of the Internal Revenue Service have really circumvents this. Because he can order you to bring it in, and then you can refuse to do it, and then they'll cite you before a court, and then you got to go for a judge for contempt. It really circumvents that. But that is what was the basis of the Fourth Amendment. And a fellow named James Otis, who was a lawyer in Boston, he resigned as Attorney General, and he took this before the courts in Boston in 1761. And he wanted to strike this down. He thought it the worst instrument of arbitrary power since the Star Chamber and the days of Charles I. Anyway, he just rambled on and on. And there was a young lawyer taking notes in the courtroom, and that's why we know about this. And that lawyer was a young man named John Adams, became President of the United States. And he wrote about it. So that was one of their complaints, was a writ of assistance. Now, it appears to me, from what I've been able to research, that the writ of assistance wasn't really the problem in reality that it said it was. That what would happen is that a customs officer would have to take it to a judge and have it approved, and the judges would put it over on the side of the desk and then build up in a file, and they never got signed. So the colonial judges were kind of helping to thwart this thing. And the reason they had to sign it is because the king had died, and under the principle of British law, it had to be redone again. It had to go back and be approved by the judges. We also had at this time the Sugar Act, and this came in just before the Stamp Act, a year before the Stamp Act. And the Sugar Act was an attempt to crack down on smuggling. So that what was happening is that the smugglers really had the system wired, so to speak. They would they get arrested for smuggling, and they'd turn around and they'd sue the customs officer, and the customs officer would usually lose, because everybody hated them, because it was sort of an anti-British deal. It was sort of like the O.J. Simpson trial, in a sense that you had a jury that wouldn't follow the law. They were going to convict him, and they wouldn't convict the customs officers. And so, in order to solve that problem, the Sugar Act transferred all of the customs cases to the Admiralty courts in Nova Scotia. And now there's no jury, and you got these pro-government courts, and so it was not well liked. But a lot of the people didn't complain, it seems, because the smuggling was so notorious that a lot of people figured smugglers were getting what they deserved. So Americans were great smugglers, but I don't think we were as good as the British. I think the British were the best smugglers there ever was, because of all the coves and caves and bays around England. The smuggling was just, and that's the reason, of course, we had the excise. Well, then, at the time that this was being debated up in London, they were, in the drawing boards, they were drawing up a Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was what made Adam Smith say, in The Wealth of Nations, and he was talking about the Stamp Act. He said, there's no art which one government learns from another than how to drain money from the pockets of the people. And actually, this was an ingenious tax. You didn't have any historical, deep historical basis. All these other taxes go back to the ancient time, but they concocted this idea that putting stamps on paper. So wills and documents and bill of ladings and everything you can think of, you had to put a stamp on it. And years ago, in some of the business I did down in the Dutch Antilles, we had to prepare contracts with stamps on them. So the stamp tax has still been around. We had it in America, again, in my experience, for real estate. You remember the Internal Revenue stamps you had to put on deeds and so forth? Some old-timers like me remember that. So the Stamp Act was really a brilliant idea, and so it was going to come to America, and the word got out what they were doing, and on top of that, King George said the same words that Walpole had used 50 years before. He said we're going to use the full weight of the crown to enforce the stamp tax on the Americans. And of course the Americans got wind of that. And so they decided to all get together. Now prior to that time the colonies were all squabbling. They didn't have much in common. And now they realized they had a common enemy. So they organized what was called the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in 1765, and this was, many historians believe, the real birthplace of the United States. Because now the colonies come together for the first time they ever had, and they have a Congress, and they have problems. And what do? They send some of their best people to London, and who was their best man was Benjamin Franklin. And he goes up and he appears before the House of Commons, and he gives his little speech, and we Americans really love the British, and we're happy with all your laws, and we're willing to obey all your laws, except we won't obey laws relating to internal taxes. And the Stamp Act is an internal tax, and other than that, we'll do anything you say. External taxes will be fine. So he really put his shoe in his mouth. So the Chancellor of Exchequer was a guy named Townshend, and he said, that is perfect nonsense. And that was what he is noted for, to make the distinction between external and internal taxes. The Americans didn't really know themselves. What they were really against was any taxes, period. That was basically, their point, but they didn't know that yet. They hadn't discovered how they really felt about it. So they go ahead and they the British cancel the taxes, and one of the reasons they did it is because there was such an embargo against British goods that all of the ships up in Liverpool and London where the commercial vessels coming to the New World couldn't come because the people were so damn mad they weren't going to buy anything from Britain, and so it was really a commercial pressure on British merchants that caused the pressure on the British Parliament, so they canceled it. And it was easy to cancel it because it was perfect nonsense. So if you don't want internal taxes, then we'll give you external taxes. We'll tax tea and all these various things, and then we have the Townshend duties. Well, now, yes?
Before you go into the Townshend Act, I want to defend George Granville a bit, who was directed the Stamp Act. He was a very thoughtful person, and Granville was always looking for the poor. And he said, okay, I want to get a tax that will least affect the poor. And so what could we do? And the stamp tax was designed for that reason in mind. It probably would escape 80% or 50% of the people in the United States because, for instance, a newspaper half the people couldn't read at all.
That's right.
Almost everybody who read were the newspapers, such as Franklin, were Whig papers in the Northeast, and so they were the only ones that were going to be good. Second, it was for lawyers, because the lawyers were the most, had the most wealth. They said, look, we're just going to ask you when you do deeds or official documents,
Wills,
you gotta pay
whole
that.
work.
It would just attack the lawyers. Oh, they were so against it because they were very, well, like they are today. They were the ones that were in the legislature and
Yeah.
wanted to do things. But really, it was a very sinful tax, and it would not have affected the most of the people. And the most expensive tax of all, I think if I remember right, it was 20 pounds, was for people who were graduating from college.
So
That's, I think,
be on the certificate, be on their diplomas, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and of course, those were the most richer people, all the lawyers, and ministers. Well, you got the ministers against. So you have the lawyers against them, the minister against them, and the weak papers against it. You were down to heaven. But if they were really focusing on people, again, that business of the best ability to pay the tax, that was what he did.
One of the
From that standpoint, it sounds pretty good.
well, it really caused the colonies to get mad. I mean, they were really mad.
Okay, good propaganda.
And they formed into groups called the Sons of Liberty, and they would parade through the streets of Boston and New York, and in all the major cities, even down in the South in Charleston, the Sons of Liberty with their placards and everything, and it would be liberty, property, and no stamps. They got that from the Dutch: liberty, property, and no excise, or wooden shoes. So now it was stamps, and they had this little song or ballad that they sang, and I've always thought it was so good. And it goes like this: a strange scheme of late has been formed in the state by a knot of political knaves, who in secret rejoice that the Parliament's voice has condemned us by law to be slaves. Brave boys, has condemned us by law to be slaves. With the beasts of the woods we will ramble for food, and lodge in wild deserts and caves, and live poor as Job on the skirts of the globe, before we'll submit to be slaves, brave boys, before we'll submit to be slaves. And so here we have that strong, you want to call it propaganda, feeling that you're going to be enslaved by the tax man. And in this case, it was just a form of slavery. And as Benjamin Franklin said, that they would approve everything except, of course, an internal tax, and that was what the Stamp Act was. The British government threw in the towel. They said, okay, if you won't take stamp taxes, then we'll give you external taxes. And he spoke to the Commons and said, we're just doing, when they adopted the Townshend duties, the custom duties, we're just doing what Dr. Franklin said when he came here to argue the repeal of the Stamp Act. So what's the problem? Well, of course, when news got out that they were going to have these custom duties, again, the colonists were mad as hell. And out of this particular thing came the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party, they still kind of enact that. I think the Cato Institute in Washington goes up to Boston certain times of the year and throws the tea in the Boston Harbor today, to reenact it as a protest against taxes. But like so many interesting events, it really wasn't a tax matter. The Boston Tea Party was not protesting against a tax on tea. What had really happened is that because of the embargo on British goods, the American colonists were pretty well attached to Dutch tea. And the Dutch would bring the tea in and smuggle it in, but that didn't seem to be a problem. Incidentally, just a side thought, if you've ever gone to Washington and you've ever gone to see the Declaration of Independence, about all you can see in that stupid, excuse my expression, in a cage they have it in, is John Hancock, because he signed it first. And he was a notorious smuggler. He was wanted by the British government for millions in taxes. And he was a big trader out of Boston, and one of the best. In fact, one of the stories is that one of the customs officers got on board a ship to search it, and the seamen gathered him and locked him up in a hole someplace while they were unloading all this wine. And all he remembers hearing the clinking of the bottles through the hours that he was in the boat. So finally he was let go. But anyway, so John Hancock was a notorious tax evader. Well, what was really happening is because of the Dutch tea, the British government the tea came in from the British Indies, and they would pay the duty on it up in London, and then from that it came onto the New World. So it was a major source. And it so happened that many of the leaders in the cabinet, maybe even the prime minister, were heavily invested in tea. It was a good investment at the time. And they couldn't sell the damn stuff because of the competition from the smuggled Dutch tea. Well, so what they did is they took off all the duties and reduced the price so low that they could outsell the smuggled Dutch tea. And so they sent off, was a 7 vessel loaded with tea were sent off from England, and the word got down to Charleston and up into Boston and New York, and so this tea was coming. And it was coming at this really low price, and they felt for sure that the American housewives would buy the British tea because it was cheaper. And this was essentially a marvelous example of dumping, so to speak. You know, we have laws against dumping, which are the Japanese and so forth dumping their products on. So that was what was behind it all. And so they were told that the Americans are not going to accept it, and some of the ships turned around and left and went back to England because they knew there were going to be a riot. Yeah.
Why wouldn't the American housewife want to get the tea cheaper?
They did. I mean that was the problem.
They wanted it. The consumer wanted the tea.
The best price, sure.
Best price. So where's the conflict?
Because it would put the merchants out of business that were handling the Dutch tea.
That's it, yeah.
And on top of that, to make the matters more irritating, the British tea was going to be limited to those British merchants who had been loyal to Britain. So it didn't. You couldn't go buy it. If you were a tea merchant and you were selling, Dutch tea, you couldn't buy this new tea. It was only limited to those loyal to the British system.
Envy on the part of one commercial interest against another. In a way.
Well,
the Dutch sellers of tea
he can't compete now.
Rioted against the undersellers, the dumpers.
Yeah.
So it really wasn't conflict with the British government. It was.
Yeah, that's right. It was simply a boycott problem and a problem of a good way to dispose of all the surplus tea, and then put the Dutch merchants, American that were pro-Dutch merchants, out of business because they couldn't buy the cheaper tea because it was limited to just a little group of British merchants. So this made everybody mad as hell, and people were drinking a lot of tea in those days. So it was a major beverage. So when they disguised themselves as Indians and they boarded the ship in the Boston Harbor and they tossed all the tea over, well, this was just the wanton destruction of private property. This in those were days where property was respected. Benjamin Franklin, all of them said, "Look, we got to compensate for this. This was wrong." But the British reacted in a very violent way, and they proceeded to close the Boston Harbor. They proceeded to hammer down on the colonies, and they were going to send in the redcoats. This really set off the revolution. But one of the things that I thought was kind of cute about this particular problem was that we think that, and we say that it was a protest against the tax on tea, but the tea, even with this itty-bitty tax, and it was an itty-bitty tax, was nothing. The tax was relatively nothing. They could have had no tax at all, and it'd still been a Boston Tea Party. But how we twisted it from a trade problem to a tax problem become the symbol. You can't tax tea is one of the amazing stories of history, and people don't.
Dark was right though. What was the existing merchants got undercut. They, just like there's a
That's right.
town here, they didn't want Walmart to come because they knew the existing merchants would be into their pocketbook, and so they didn't run it.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it was. That was what the whole damn thing was all about, to be honest. And yet we still go on to the Boston Tea Party, and it was a tax on tea. The tea tax was the pittance. It was really it was really funny.
You know, the other thing that happened too was Governor Etcherson was really dumb because the other ones, they could leave, but he says they had a rule you can't leave without paying the departure taxes. We can't pay the departure taxes. We haven't got any money to sell. You tell me. So it was a Mexican standoff there, and that was really dumb.
One of the great, I guess, patriarchs of the American Revolution was Patrick Henry. I mean, we all remember in high school, "Give me liberty or give me death." You know. Patrick Henry was he was not in favor of big government. He's not in favor of national government. And when he heard that they had met in Philadelphia, and I just was getting, he said, "I smell a rat." An interesting comment that he made. But he wrote this famous speech that he gave, of "Give me liberty, give me death," when he ended. The best part of the speech is in the middle. And he says, "There is no retreat but in submission and slavery." Here we get that slavery again. "Our chains are forged." Well, you know, chains are what you forge around the ankles of a slave. "Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war," and he's talking about the Boston Tea Party problem, "the war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, let it come." And that was, I think, far more important than "Give me liberty, give me death." Go on.
If the British, I'm just curious, do you have an idea of what percent of the British budget, the Crown's budget, was gained from taxing the colonies? And I'm wondering if they had eliminated any overt taxes on the colonists, would not they still have, the Crown still have prospered just because of the trade?
Oh yeah. This is what they call mercantilism, where the colonies produce the raw materials and they're a major market, and then the manufactured goods from Britain come to the colonies. You know, this was the game plan in those days.
They could have gotten along without any overt taxation.
Well, see, the problem was they were at war with France, and they needed money. And the wars cost money. And this was what was behind the British attempt to tax the colonies was the war with France. And
a lot of that war was in the United States.
Well, yeah, and they had 10,000 British troops stationed here to protect from the French, which is one of the arguments that was made. He said, "Look, you're the luckiest guys in the world. I mean, you've got the protection of the British Empire. You've got jobs for everybody. Your sons aren't conscripted and sent off to fight faraway wars, and you have the lowest taxes imaginable. Why can't you pay a few bucks to the British government for this war with France?" And what had happened is just on the eve of this, in London, there had been riots because one of the excise taxes was on cider. And so we had these riots in London on the excise tax on cider, and then they had to cancel the excise tax, and that's when they turned on the colonies. Probably that excise tax riot may have been instrumental, but see, the British guy named Samuel Johnson wrote a book called "Taxes, No Tyranny," and you probably still can get it. He argued that every government has the right to claim funds from its citizens for their protection. And that's just a fundamental right of sovereignty. And all the British government was doing was exercising that right because the Americans were benefiting from it. Because they had 10,000 redcoats stationed in America and somebody had to feed them. And the British were pretty mad about it because they heard all these stories about how the Americans were so rich and everything, and they were making money off the British soldiers who were spending their money in the New World, and so they just thought they should pay a little tax. And one of the illustrations in the book where it shows two Englishmen sitting in a necessary house. You know what a necessary house is? No, but it's an outhouse. Yeah, it was an outside. It was necessary. It had an interesting name, didn't it? And it shows these two Englishmen, one sitting on the pot on one side, and he's reading Taxation, No Tyranny. And the other guy is ripping up the protest of the Continental Congress to the Parliament over taxes, and he's using it to wipe himself with. And then in the background is this picture of a tarred and feathered British tax agent. It's a great illustration, and it's true. A lot of times you'll see the liberty of some of these early cartoons and things that we wouldn't do today. And that's one I think that's pretty good. Anyway, so we're getting ready for the good old American Revolution, and away it goes. And for some strange reason, we lost all the battles, but we won the war. And then at the time they signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, they also passed a resolution to call for the creation of Articles of Confederation for the United States. And those Articles of Confederation were drafted. The name of the country was to become the United States in Congress assembled. They adopted the Spanish dollar and a lot of interesting things. But they put in that document that they could not tax, because that would defeat the purpose of the revolution, the tax, particularly by an external authority. So the Congress could not tax. And this thing was finally ratified in 1781. And of course they didn't have any money. The chief financial officer was a guy named Robert Morris. And he said, the Congress had the liberty of asking and doing everything. The states had the liberty of paying nothing. And when they will pay into the national government, we'll call it that, is known only to him who knoweth all things. But that was a problem. And of course, as the government tried to function and stumble around, and it was in terrible shape, and Madison was deeply concerned about it. What are you going to do? You have to have taxing power. So nothing was happening. They called a convention at Philadelphia to see if they could amend the Articles of Confederation and give the government the power to tax. Nobody was going to show up. And then some guy named Daniel Shea, he was an old veteran of the Revolutionary War, and a lot of his unhappy people up there in Massachusetts, they had a little bit of a riot, and it was called the Shays' Rebellion. It wasn't really much. He got these old veterans together, and they got their muskets, and they were raising because how hard life had been because of all the debts that the states had because of the Revolution. As they approached the federal arsenal, or what there was of an old arsenal, a couple of cannons were fired and they all ran home. Well, the press got a hold of this and made it into a big thing. And they said, look how weak this country is. He said, why, the police force in Genoa could defeat the United States in a battle. And so then it spread, and everybody then got together and they sent delegates to Philadelphia. They says, we really do have to do something. So if it hadn't been for Daniel Shea and his ragged bunch of unhappy, Revolutionary War veterans, and they were getting to be old guys by now, they never had a constitution. So they all sent delegates to Philadelphia to draft the Constitution. It has been praised by, I think Gladstone said it was the most marvelous document ever written by the hand of man. It is a remarkable piece of work. It's just too bad we don't believe in it today as much as we should. The main purpose there was to amend the Articles of Confederation and give the government the power to tax. And very first article says Congress will have the power to tax. But the taxes have to be uniform throughout the United States. And so that was the big argument, the big problem. But when they got together, they decided, well, let's not amend the article, let's just start all over again. And they created the Constitution. That was a little clever, tricky move because the Articles of Confederation could only have been amended by unanimous action of all the states, and they never made it. So they made it so that when 3/4 of the states approve it, then it's the law. Interesting. I mean, they just by their bootstraps they changed the whole game plan. It was also in that article that they gave the limited powers of Congress, and that was in theory the government were supposed to have. The federal government is limited to certain specific things that it can do, and that the 10th Amendment, as you know, that came later, said that powers not expressed or reserved to the Congress are reserved to the people. But that didn't seem to me what's good either. We then have this new government, and they decided to make Washington our first president, and he establishes the principle only 2 terms until Roosevelt came along, and he made 4 terms, so we changed that. They then needed money, and they had a lot of debts, and they really did have a lot of debts. Did you know it took up until 1830 for America to pay off the Revolutionary War debts? And a lady got in touch with me some time ago about her, great-grandfather or something, who was one of the early financiers from Europe of the American Revolution. And he produced guns and all kinds of things and shipped them to Americans, fight the British. And, of course, he never got paid. He died, and they didn't have any money to pay him, even after the Constitution was formed. Well, Hamilton comes along, and he decides that we need an excise tax. Now, that's fighting words in those days. I mean, there's probably nothing you could say that would be more, because all these people had come from Britain, all these people come from Europe. They hated an excise. And then he said, well, the country drinks too much anyway, so we need a health measure, and we'll put a tax on whiskey. And who could complain? A tax on whiskey, no big deal. It's like a sin tax today or on tobacco or something. Well, the farmers out in the West, particularly western Pennsylvania, didn't think that was such a good deal. They thought taxes had to be uniform in the United States. That's what the Constitution said. And here we are, poor farmers, and they're poor, out in the West, trying to make a living, and we're the only ones that are taxed. So they organized their regiments and their groups, and they were mad as hell, and they killed a few people, and they tarred and feathered. There's some interesting pictures in that book, particularly, of them tarring and feathering taxmen and sending them out. They really had enough. And it was just damn unfair. Now, their problem, the reason they got stuck with a tax is because they couldn't ship their wheat and their grain across to where the markets were, over on the East Coast, because of the Appalachian Mountains and because the travel was so difficult. And how could you make 10 wagon loads of grain and ship it over to Philadelphia or over to the eastern coast? So they said, well, look, if we distill the wheat and the grain into whiskey, then it's small, and then we can ship it across to the west, to the East Coast. And so that's what they did. So, and it became a form of money. They didn't have money, so they were also trading in whiskey too. It became the way they paid for things. So this was what was really behind the poor whiskey rebellion. But it was a wonderful thing, because here on the frontier, these farmers rose up and revolted against an unjust tax, and they were damn right. They had a point. And when Jefferson was going for the presidency, sometime later, made it clear they were going to repeal the whiskey tax. Well, they had another tax in the meantime, and this one is interesting because I did some study on it. It was a guy named John Fries who was an auctioneer, and they then came along with the whiskey tax, and making any headway. They came off with a land tax, believe it or not, one coming under the direct tax, a portion of them on the states. And they were sending out assessors and things to measure the homes and so forth, for this assessment. And I guess we're still in Pennsylvania, yeah. And anyway, John Fries is an auctioneer, and so they they grab some of these assessors and rough them up and run them out of town. And of course, at that time, John Adams was president, so he proceeds to send out the militia, and the militia arrest John Fries and all of his compatriots. He's then tried for treason. He's then sentenced to be shot or be hung, executed for treason. He then applies to the President of the United States, John Adams, for pardon. And now this is Alexander Hamilton's tax. You know, he thinks this is really a good deal. Yes.
How can defying the tax be treason?
Because they roughed up the tax guys, and that was war against the United States. You see, it wasn't a logical case. So it came. In fact, the judge who did this really railroaded this guy. I mean, Fries, he really railroaded him. He just instructed. In fact, so much so that his lawyer quit and said, "I'm not going to have anything to do with this court proceeding." I wish I could think of the name of who that guy was, because a few years later there was an attempt to impeach him, the judge, because he was a tough cookie. And why I know a little bit about this is that the Chief Justice of the United States, Rehnquist or whatever his name is, I hate the guy. Anyway, he wrote an article and he discussed these impeachment proceedings against the judge, and that it was a wonderful thing that he didn't get impeached. And I wrote in a letter to the publisher, and I said, that was the worst thing that ever happened. They should have impeached that guy. He was a despicable judge. And it's no virtue to keep guys like that on the bench. So they published my thing. And I said, the Chief Justice is all wet, which he was. And then, anyway, it went up before the cabinet of John Adams for a pardon. And the cabinet voted to uphold the conviction and execute John Fries. And John Adams signed, said, "Sorry, fellas, I'm going to let this guy out. I'm going to pardon him." He said, "That wasn't treason. That was just a little riot." That's all it was, which is really what it all was. But Hamilton and his bunch, they wanted to nail this guy to establish the strength of the national government. They were always trying to find some way to hang their hat on it. So thus we had Fry's rebellion. So we had three rebellions in this period. We had Shays' rebellion, which was nothing, but hadn't occurred. There may never been a constitution. Then we had the Whiskey Rebellion, which was really a real first-class rebellion. But see, those people in the Whiskey Rebellion, when they finally threw in the towel, George Washington pardoned them all. He granted them all amnesty. So nobody was executed. And they did create war against the United States. You know, they were an angry bunch. Not just tar and feather, and there were a few people got killed. And then we had Fry's Rebellion, which was was only interesting to me. Well, it was against the tax, there's no question about that, but because the attempt to execute the guy for treason against the United States, all it was a riot. So John Adams, even though he has the name Adams, he's a pretty good president. In my opinion.
I think a really interesting thing is, though, that here in 1798, you have a direct tax by the federal government on private property.
Yeah.
I did not even know this existed until I ran across it during my ancestor who had a farm in Massachusetts, and I saw this tax bill from the federal government. It wasn't small. And I saw you picked it up in your book, of course, that it was a direct tax, but to my knowledge, that's the first direct tax in the federal government till the Civil War.
Another thing about this Continental Congress, to realize how disastrous it was, is since they had no money, and they couldn't collect any money, they issued what were called continentals. There was money, and I may have a picture of them in this book. Anyway, there was a wonderful saying that has lived on: "It ain't worth a continental." You ever heard that before? It ain't worth a farthing, it's worth a continental, because people had this damn paper that they were issuing, they had no money behind it. So that was. Well, I guess we kind of come up through, I covered just what I wanted to. maybe I'll set the stage for the Civil War. I think we'll talk about that this afternoon. The government, of course, operated pretty much on custom duties, which was what they had in designed anyway, and the tariff began in around 1815 or 16 because there was we'd had the war with Britain again, and there was some need now to have our own industries, and so they adopted a little protective tariff at that time. South was in favor of it, and that particular the tariff set the stage for the American Civil War. There's a lot of I've had a lot of static on that issue, but I've also had some support. I'm not the first one that said that the Civil War was over economic issues. It was, and very much so at the time. The one guy was that said a lot about it was Charles Dickens, and he wrote a couple of articles in which he said that I will tell you this week what the war is not about, and I'll tell you next week what the war is really about. And his comment was beautifully written. He said, Union means so many millions a year lost to the South. Secession means the loss of the same millions to the North. The love of money is the root of this as of many, many other evils. The quarrel between the North and the South is, as it stands, solely a fiscal quarrel. Not a word of slavery in there. And Charles Dickens, he pretty outstanding guy, one of the great minds. In fact, somebody wrote a book about him, and he called him the last great man. And he was in everything. And this was a journal that he published along with everything else. And if you go into many-sized bookstores, you'll see Dickens's books, all of the wonderful books that he wrote. So we have Charles Dickens on our side, and I we'll discuss a little bit of the tariff. I didn't want to get into it today, but I just whet your appetites for that. I remember when I first wrote about that some years ago. I was in Arizona at the time, and a fellow called me up and heard about me, and he said, "Could I have lunch with you?" And I said, "Sure." And so I went down to Phoenix, and we had lunch, and he said, "Well, I read your article on the tariff and tax discussion in the Civil War, and it reminded me of my university days when my American history professor told me that the Civil War was not over slavery, it was over taxes." And he says, he says, I still remember that, because with ever since then, it's always been a slave battle, a slave issue. So it was fun to find out that there's still a few people that know how to think and accept history for what it is, but we'll talk about it. I'm going to kind of let you guys, any questions you have about the early days, yeah?
I've heard some commentary, and I can't remember where it came from. It's about the moral bankers at the time, and they had loaned England as well as some of the other countries money, and they were putting a squeeze on England to pay the money back or the interest, maybe both. And at about the time that England decided to try to get more taxation from the colonies, and similar to what the International Monetary System is doing now to Argentina, Brazil.
So you're going back to the American Revolution then, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there were a lot of little wrinkles about that, yeah. Who else? Yeah, well, I'm sorry.
Well, it just seems that throughout history, the sort of bottom line justification for government taxation is so that it can defend the people against foreign enemies.
So, okay.
Yet, the only defensive war the U.S. has ever fought was financed privately. So
Was what?
Was financed privately. When you're talking about all the debts that the U.S. colonies owed, they didn't tax to finance.
Now, which war are you talking about?
The Revolutionary War.
Oh, the Revolutionary War, yeah.
So that sort of seems to give the lie to that claim that taxes are necessary to defend against foreign enemies. I'm just wondering if you have any comments.
Well, that's what the Constitution, for common defense was what you could spend money for. And it's talking about taxes. It says they should spend for the common
But that's
defense.
not how it's been used.
Pardon?
But that's not how it's been used.
No. Yeah.
When did income tax come about? Because the Constitution doesn't say anything about the income tax.
Well, I'll talk about that, but not right now. We'll save that. Whet your appetite.
During this period,
Yeah.
how did the banking transactions and the trade transactions and the financing of the American enterprise take place? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, yeah, those are the days when banks had money. Yeah, I mean, the real stuff, specie and stuff like that. Yeah.
So these plantation owners had access to banks to finance their plantations.
Well, I assume they did. Yeah,
industry.
I assume they did. And of course, Europe was a big lender into the Americas too, all through this period, one of the great sources
Who
of
were the lending
capital
sources?
investment.
The England and the French.
Well, it would be the
Swiss.
banks. It wasn't governments. They had.
Yeah.
America was a very lucrative place, a very profitable place. I mean, that's where the money went there. Yeah.
When I get home, I'm going to try to find this reference, and I'm going to send it to you. But Dickens, one can make a case that Dickens is not is a 100% great guy as you think.
Oh.
There was a
That seems to happen with so many of our heroes,
in the debate over slavery in England, there were two factions fighting each other, and it's surprising. Dickens and a bunch of authors were on the side of retaining slavery, and one of the Cretans with him was the guy who coined the phrase "dismal silence" against economists, Carta. And on the other side, advocating for getting rid of slavery were Darwin, the evangelicals, and economists, and people in business.
How about John Stuart Mill?
Yeah, and Knell.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Dickens was on the wrong side of something.
Well, he did write some
it's not
articles.
well known.
He did write a journal, and in it he had an article on slavery. He was pretty hostile to it. It wasn't too good. I actually put that in my new book that I'm doing. My latest, maybe my last project. I'm collecting foreign journals on the Civil War, and I've been doing it for about 2-3 years now. And I'm into the French and the German, and these people really had an insight into the war that Americans never had. They really saw it for what it was. But they didn't have any problem. Here you couldn't say anything without ending up in jail, if you did. So it's interesting. And he did. I'm trying to think of what the name of that journal was, Household Words or something, published around in the 1850s, and he talks about slavery. Well, it wasn't too complimentary. He felt he was one along with many that said if the South was successful, that slavery would end sooner than if they stayed in the Union, and that was a fairly common view in Europe, that if the South seceded, slavery would end sooner than if they stayed in the Union. Now, you might want to let that tickle your mind a little bit, because if they were fighting for slavery, that didn't make any sense. But if they weren't fighting for slavery, then maybe it does make some sense. And
You always look for your personal money. One other reason Dickens was so disgusted was he didn't get royalty. The copyright here was very weak, and so he was furious that all these novels were printed in the United States. He gave money, so he wanted to attack the United States for it.
What is the difference between fees and tax? Because nowadays everything is named fees instead of tax.
well, you can call a tax anything. You remember Margaret Thatcher called it a community tax. Yeah, well, fees are just forms of tax. You get on the highway and they charge you a duty, on the turnpikes and stuff. You can charge whatever you want to. It's a fee, like lawyers have their annual fee that they have to pay to the Bar Association. It's still a tax. Yeah,
So probably in order to make it better,
because tax is a bad word, so we'll call it a fee. Yeah, okay, you still have to pay it. Yeah, okay. Oh well. Well, what else about
regarding a stamp tax?
Yeah.
When I was a kid in Canada,
Yeah.
you required a stamp on a check.
Yeah, I've seen that in other countries. I've seen the stamp on a check. Yeah.
Well, when I got old enough to write checks, it had been done away with because we didn't
Yeah.
put stamps on them.
Yeah, no, I've seen that.
Sure, they did it.
In fact, I think the Dutch had that. Yeah, yeah. No, it was common. The stamp tax was a really good idea, a way to raise revenue, and you had to. I remember when I used to would lawyer it, and I read deeds they have to record. I'd have to go down to the post office and buy so many revenue stamps and stick them on the deeds, and then you recorded it, and it showed you paid the tax. I think it was not a bad idea myself, but they got rid of it because it was easier just to make an income tax and just raise the rates and hammer on everybody. It worked better. It was just one tax that would do the job. Yes.
Tomorrow morning you're going to talk about current taxation.
Yeah.
And current ideas.
Tomorrow I'm going to talk about the income tax, and it hits history and where it is today, and the federal state tax, things like that.
You talk about alternate schemes and ideas.
Well, yeah, I'm always interested in listening to some of the new ones, because like the national sales tax is a real popular idea, and then I told you about the one tax guy had a lot of possibilities out there. I think that if we can do all the wonderful things we can technologically, why can't we have a good tax system using our wits, in some way, and get away from all the abusive problems that we have under the current tax laws? It's just,
There are no good taxes.
You got that.
well,
Here he is.
well, what did Pope say? Whoever hopes a faultless tax to see, hopes what never was and never will be. And that was 1750 or something like that. So, yeah. My own experience with taxes have been, if the rates are low and reasonable, people will pay it. You can call it anything you want to, but people will pay it if the rates are low.
reasonable rate is 0%.
Well, okay. I can live with 3%. You remember the Chinese emperor who was governing by doing nothing, and his tax was 3%, and yet the mandate of heaven was 10. And actually, the 10% tax is a pretty hefty tax. The biblical time, a pretty heavy tax. And I get a little bit discouraged about. All you have to do is get to know these guys in the Congress, and you really get discouraged. I mean, they're really something. They're really numbers. When I spoke to the House Ways and Means Committee, I had a hassle with Charlie Rangel, and that was interesting. God, and he's the head-ranking Democrat, so if the Democrats win the House, he's going to be the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee.
Where do we move to? Where do we move to? You said?
Well, I think the answer is, you remember Oswald who murdered President Kennedy?
No, heard of it.
Yeah. Well, the question is, where is Oswald now that we need him? I can't take credit for that. My friend said, oh, gosh. Well, so that revolution every 20 years. But I just want to stay out of the Civil War. I give until we'll go into Civil War this afternoon. I think that's a nice subject, and I think being here in the South, you'll all have a lot to say about it. I think you should have a lot to say about it. And if it was a major tax event, then that's a little different twist than everybody's getting today. I think people want to see the Civil War as bad guys and good guys, and the South is the bad guy, and the Northerners is the good guys. But they don't realize that the Northerners hated the black people much worse than the South ever possibly hated the black people, and that was well known. It was just up there they were lepers. In fact, so much so they didn't want to touch them. the skin, the black skin, the feeling it might rub off on them or something. And that was in the North, and they had those terrible race riots, as you might know, up in New York, in which probably the most massive lynching of blacks in American history took place in New York in 1863.
That's a good trivia question I play on people because I ask which state holds the record for illegal lynchings of blacks, and it's New York.
New York, yeah. And they did it all, and in fact they hung them on lampposts, and they hung old crippled blacks that were blind. I mean, they were just mad, and a lot of them were the Irish that did it, from what I understand. But anyway, we'll get to the Civil War, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy it.
Did they tax banks and money flows and things like that back in this period?
Well, the only tax I know was on checks and commercial paper, and that would be in effect a tax on the bank.
Bankers pretty much had a free reign and
Yeah.
free flow of capital.
Yeah. Well, it's good for the country to do that. There was a second whiskey rebellion following the Civil War, which I've written about it, in which the tax was on the South on the moonshine and stuff like that. And, it was pretty rough. That was the birthplace of the Internal Revenue Service, and their job was to enforce the tax on whiskey, and a lot of people got killed in that.
Well, I live next to the land between the lakes, and that's why the federal government bought that out, because they couldn't get rid of moonshine.
Yeah.
They kind of came in there in the 60s and 50s and just bought it all up in the national park.
What was one old guy who was being let off to jail? He says for making moonshine. He says, "Well, my grandpappy fit in the Revolution, and I can't understand why I just can't make a little moonshine." Isn't that what he fit for? And his hillbilly jargons.
One of the reason for the Shays Rebellion, there were all the debts from the Revolutionary War, and most of the soldiers who were having to pay it back. So if you were a veteran, they were only going to collect 20 cents on the dollar at most of the states, except Massachusetts. Massachusetts was held by only 6 families. They bought all the debts, and one of which, by the way, was Adams. And so they were going to collect $1 for the for the Continentals. They weren't going to have a discount. That was one of the things that really got Shays outraged, because he knew what the other states were doing and forgiving part of the debt, and they wouldn't do it.
Well,
and then Adam wanted to get Washington and the other states to come in and help their militia. And they said, "No, we're not going to do that." So it was. Then they decided, well, they're going to make a stronger constitution where the individual militias would not be just them responsible. We're going to get other people to come in and take the tax.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other interesting observations on this period? I'll let you go then. Okay.